I'm very rarely lost for words, but even I felt somewhat nauseous after that Club Brugge loss. And you know me, I like to look at things from a rational viewpoint, not some kind of knee-jerky emotional response. Was this unraveling because of a late equalizer against Bournemouth? Was there an additional hangover because of a heavy loss at Spurs? Because to quote the cinematic masterpiece and multi-Oscar award-winning movie Austin Powers' The Spy Who Shagged Me, crikey, we've lost our mojo! Presented by 24/7 Services, let's pick through yet another demoralizing loss. Club Brugge 1, Aston Villa 0. Welcome inside a very somber parlor. And heading into Wednesday, Villa had never won a European game on Belgian soil, and one can forgive Villa fans for thinking, well, that was going to come to an end this week. And in previewing this match, I noted the discrepancy in respective transfer values between the two, noting that it could be a trap, but also look at the average collective ages of each respective club. And this is why games are played on grass and not on paper. Brugge had to win this game in order to stay in the competition, basically, but we gifted it to them in a giant box with some ribbon and a lovely bow on top, and even a little note that said, "You're welcome." As for our hosts, you know, that was their 100th game in Europe's top club competition. They scored the first ever goal in Champions League, but it had been 30 years since they defeated an English opponent. Needless to say, European competition is woven into the very fabric of that football club, and mad respect. They 100% deserve to win that game. And for Unai Emery, this now represents a really difficult challenge, because is it a tactical structural issue, or is this some kind of mental issue? And both require very different approaches. One of the questions we should always ask ourselves after games is how much of it came down to a very tactically astute performance by the home side versus Villa's inability to create, either individually or collectively, any meaningful moments. Two teams play the games. It's not always just, well, one team was really poor. And one of many concerns I have from Wednesday is that Club Brugge has now presented to the world the blueprint on how to stifle Aston Villa, because we had no answers on how they set up without the ball, and we didn't have any individual moments of brilliance to bail us out. Funny enough, some dear friends of mine visited Brugge, Belgium this summer, and they absolutely loved it. Really interesting country with numerous languages being used depending on where you are, and regional cuisine and culture also based on which part of the country you're in. I would absolutely love to visit this country one day, and you could see why here. Did you know that the Holy Trinity show has already published over 200 episodes? I couldn't believe that. I don't mark milestones. I didn't think much of it, but it's still pretty cool. And this show was designed to explore the three key issues or moments that, in this case, defined Brugge 1, Villa 0. Making the trek to Belgium was our senior and dedicated correspondent, the very capable Samir, here wearing an original Henson goalkeeping shirt from 85 to 87. And I feel really bad for Samir and everyone else who was expecting to go to that beautiful city and potentially watch Villa put one boot into the Champions League top 8 had we won. Looking at the key numbers, they don't paint as bleak a picture as what we saw with our eyeballs, but XG was low on the Villa side. We had but one shot on target from 8 mostly long-range speculative attempts. The one big chance created, which I think was McGinn's header, went over the top. Pass completion and possession is meaningless without purpose, and tackles won told a story. We were second best in so many instances, and collectively, Club Brugge also ran 6 6 kilometers more in the distance covered metric. Fair point issue. Ross Barkley's injury came at a very inopportune time for us. To quote a lyric from legendary Canadian songstress Joni Mitchell, sometimes you don't know what you got till it's gone. And Barkley might have come on in that Tottenham game and calmed things down a little bit, kept us in possession, tried to pick the lock into some of those gaps in midfield, which is part of our identity. Not to mention giving some relief to our other midfielders who have been taxed over the last couple of weeks. But maybe most importantly of all, the guy has experience, senior experience. And when everybody's looking around for somebody to lead, maybe it could have been him. Relatively big issue, especially in a tight game, was our planning and execution on set pieces. I know we didn't have a whole lot of them, but between Tielemans and Bailey and McGinn, the delivery was poor. There was no inventiveness. And honestly, Simon Mignolet will not have had an easier game against Aston Villa, well, since his last one in 2016 when he was with Liverpool and they beat us 6-0 at Villa Park. Sobering reality check. Anyone who thinks that Boubacar Kamara, Tyrone Mings, or Emi Buendia are just going to dive straight back into their 2023 form because of a couple of games and appearances here and there has never had a serious injury setback. The mental side might be the most difficult because there is this little voice inside your head that keeps wondering, what if it happens again? Physically, your timing is off. Your fitness is off. Your familiarity with your teammates is not there yet. It's like stepping onto a treadmill that's going 100 miles an hour. I'm actually quite shocked at how well Boubacar Kamara has played, considering of the three, his ACL injury was by far the closest to now. Big issue number 3, opportunity over. Yes, I know that sounds gloomy, but this was an opportunity. We got a plum draw. Not just the teams we were playing, but the order in which they came. This was a chance for us to solidify our spot in the top 8. And you know that some of the big boys who've had harder schedules and opponents than us would eventually start winning and climb up the table, and that's what's happened. Unai Emery was talking before this game about how good our position was and how many points it might take for us to stay in that top 8. And within the course of 2 hours and under incredible circumstances, we went from 1st to 8th with teams 9 through 12 breathing down our necks. And if we lose at home to Juventus, they will leapfrog us. Our stated objective within the club is to maintain Champions League football regularly through high Premier League table finishes. And that would be made much easier if we didn't have extra games to play, like the playoff round in mid-February, where we already have 4 very tricky fixtures scheduled. That would mean 2 3-game weeks where we've struggled. So even a 0-0 draw on Wednesday psychologically would have been favorable because we would have maintained our clean sheet run, not to mention an unbeaten run, and we'd currently be sitting tied for 3rd in the table. Instead, for the first time in his managerial career, Unai Emery conceded a goal in Belgium. And to concede it that way, perhaps more problematic than even the Champions League campaign, is that this negative momentum ball is starting to roll a little bit, and there's just no real explanation for it. And you could almost see it on Unai Emery's face, the realization sinking in that something is not right here and that he is devoid of answers. This came after we were trailing, and you can see in his posture, his body language, a little air of desperation even. This is the most difficult period in Unai's Aston Villa tenure. And how he gets us out of it is going to be very intriguing, because we've always been able to say that Unai Emery teams bounce back after poor performances. Well, that's 3 losses in a row now, and we really only have 2 injured senior players. And if we think that it will somehow get easier now, or that a little break might be helpful, well, let's hope so. I mean, it has been a demanding schedule, and certainly Bournemouth, Tottenham, Club Brugge, these aren't mugs, okay? These are good opponents. But what worries me is when we've needed somebody to step up and create something on an individual basis, even to give us a lift, it hasn't happened. And who's that player going to be? John Duran is ice cold. Yuri Tielemans dropped off. Morgan Rogers maybe can't do it by himself. John McGinn, If it's Emi Martinez, you're in trouble. And that's kind of how it was on Wednesday. Juventus is going to be a difficult challenge. They are a seasoned Champions League outfit, and we're fortunate to have them at home. And I could probably say the same for the Celtic game. But those last two away games at Leipzig and Monaco, based on what I've seen, I would be surprised if we came out of those two games with anything. Leipzig has had a terrible Champions League campaign, but they are extremely good at home, and they are in the mix for a Bundesliga title this year, in my opinion. So that's why coming out of this game on Wednesday with nothing may be very damaging for those top 8 hopes. Big issue number 2, tactically trumped. You see what I did there? A little topical tie-in because of what's going on. I'm proud of that one. But there can be no argument. Our Spanish tactician did not have an answer for Nicky Hayen and his young underdog Club Brugge side. And they were underdogs. They won't mind that tag. When you consider the quality of the two leagues and you look at the transfer values of the respective clubs, Aston Villa were the heavy favorites here. But you can have all the strategic planning you want, all the tactical analysis. You could do video work until the cows come home. If you don't have the players who can actually execute that plan, all of that is meaningless. But Club Brugge were up to the task and buoyed by fantastic home support. They have their own European nous. I talked about the Champions League experience, but last year they too were beaten semi-finalists in the Europa Conference League. Now, Unai Emery made a little tweak to his setup because he had McGinn and Rodgers playing as narrow 10s behind Watkins, which seemed logical, even if it didn't yield any results. The biggest challenge for us tactically was that we were simply incapable in midfield of playing between the Club Brugge lines, which is what we like to do before accelerating into that front third. And that required discipline and patience from the home side. A great metric to show how well they did in that regard was interceptions. The home side had 9 of them. The amount of times we lost second balls in this game was astounding. And there's not really a stat for that anywhere I can find, because it's not a duel. It's what kind of happens after the duel. Maybe Monchi and all his analytics has some kind of metric or analysis in that regard, but it was happening all over the field. The amount of times the ball just bounced off of Ollie Watkins, who was totally isolated or surrounded by 3 Club Brugge players, it was astonishing. And then when we needed some quality from open play or maybe a dead ball situation, it was almost as if the jeering got to Yuri Tielemans, because that might have been his worst performance in an Aston Villa jersey. Football is just so weird sometimes. After Bournemouth, I was lamenting the fact that despite opening them up like a can of beans time and time again, we did not convert on numerous great situations. Since then, where have all those great situations gone? You look at our big chances, we've had hardly any since. And I realize Ollie Watkins has been asked to stay central. But when he's surrounded by sometimes 1, 2, and even 3 defenders, and there's nobody on either side to play off of, then what? We're relying on Morgan Rogers to try to beat 3 or 4 players. And when he doesn't do that, then what? What Aston Villa is missing right now is a game breaker. I've already spoken a couple of times this season about Villa's risk versus reward strategy, where we avoid getting into a back and forth open game, presumably to insulate our defenders from being exposed, but also to control the game and maybe even to lessen the stress during these congested weeks. But there is a problem with that when you fall behind, because you're leaving yourself less time to chase an equalizer. Did you notice how often Morgan Rogers released? He would break when Diego Carlos was on the ball, like the 2-0 goal versus Bologna, where he played it into the channel for Rogers. Well, Carlos played that ball once and he way overhit it. And this is the problem. Great if you score first, tough if you don't, especially away from home. And I just wonder, are we trying to be too clever? Can we not just test a backline once in a while? We had our first major wind and rainstorm of the season on Monday. It reminded me a lot of the weather on our first trip to Birmingham in 2023. Lots of damage though, trees down, power outages, that kind of thing. But I do love those kind of storms. And Paul Handsaker of 24/7 Services knows that when the wind starts whipping and the rain starts driving, there's a pretty good chance he's going to get an early morning wake-up call, although that doesn't really matter much to Paul because the man doesn't sleep, I don't think. I mean, he has 4 kids at home, 2 big dogs, his parents, he coaches football, he has to support the Villa, he's in bed at midnight, up at 6 a.m. every single morning without an alarm, ready to go. I sincerely hope that you never have an emergency and that you have to call 24/7 for that. But isn't it comforting to know that if something happens to your roof or there's a leak or a flood or something, somebody is there for you, and the company named itself after this idea of being available to you 24/7. I would also hope that as a viewer of the Holy Trinity show, you would never call those numbers with something frivolous. And by the way, I also think somebody should invite Paul Handsaker into their executive suite at Villa Park because he's kind of become a little bit of a European good luck charm for us over the years. You'll find the Liverpool, Manchester, and Birmingham emergency numbers in their website, but I always put the Birmingham emergency number in the description of these videos. And the number one big moment that defined Brugge 1, Villa 0, Mings' monumental mistake. Sadly, 24/7 services can't fix brains. I want to start this by showing some empathy towards Tyrone Mings because I simply cannot imagine what the last 24 hours would have been like. He's a complex individual. He's a leader. He's only just back and playing and feeling good again, and we're going to depend on him down the line. So I could only imagine. I mean, if you played amateur football like I did and you've cost your team a game because of a mistake, you know what that feels like. It's extremely lonely. Happened to me all the time and I hated it. I stewed on it. I wondered sometimes, why do I want to keep doing this? And I didn't have a contract or a mansion or nice cars to sort of soften the blow a little bit. But also as crap amateur players, we didn't have to worry about the media, social media, and all that scrutiny that is on these modern-day players now. And Aston Villa is kind of under a microscope because of our exploits of late. So this thing gets amplified much, much bigger. I don't think I'm being dramatic when I say that this might be the biggest brain-dead moment in the 150-year history of Aston Villa Football Club. I can't compare it to anything else. The Enkelman one, that was just bad football for me. But with all the money and the stakes that are now involved in modern day football, it's got to be up there, and there's no excuse for it. And don't tell me, well, it wasn't called at Arsenal, so it shouldn't have been called here. Wrong. It should have been called there. And the fact that it wasn't is probably precisely why it was called here, because you know there would have been a memo sent round to the referees saying, yeah, that's a penalty. The ball is clearly set down, and Emi Martinez plays it out as a restart. There's no question about that. Tyrone Mings picks it up. It's a handball. It is a penalty 100 times out of 100. And in fact, Tyrone Mings already on a yellow card should have been sent off because by definition in the laws of the game, that is an intentional handball, and the referee likely spared him of that indignity because of the extraordinary nature of the moment and that decision. This was a catastrophic, self-inflicted error that may still have ramifications down the line. There's no excusing it. There's no defending it. Unai Emery certainly did not afterwards. But now how he handles this situation from a man management standpoint is going to be absolutely critical. What do you say? Probably nothing at all. Probably you approach Tyrone Mings and you say, how are you feeling? From that standpoint, because we are going to need Tyrone Mings over the next couple of months. And even our penalty whispering goalkeeper could not bail us out this time. And I knew it right then and there. And it's a weird and awful feeling when that happens, that feeling in the pit of your stomach. I knew that Club Brugge was not going to waste the gift that they've been given and then the momentum that came along with it. Very similar to the 1-1 goal at Tottenham. I felt the same way. There was no indication in the Aston Villa team that they were capable at that time of some kind of early season come from behind victory. And, you know, like the 1-1 goal at Tottenham, it was as if we took the proverbial punch to the button in the ring. And for the rest of the time, we're staggering around, wondering how on earth could we allow that to happen? And neither you nor I can say for certain that without that colossal up, Villa might not have still gone on and won the game. I mean, it was all to play for there at 0-0. Their body language wasn't terrible, and Brugge wasn't really creating a whole lot on their own at that time. Unfortunately, players are human beings. So after something like that, voices will 100% start creeping into their heads. Oh my goodness, how could we let something like that happen? What if this? What if that? What will this mean? So this wasn't just a seismic moment in a match. This could have ramifications on our entire Champions League campaign, and I really hope I'm wrong, but also our regular Premier League campaign, committed by a guy who's been tagged over his career by being a mistake in him, Mings, a senior player who others respect and look up to. The Sill Hill Brewery star performer was virtually impossible to choose because I don't think any one player was worthy of the honor. Maybe Emi Martinez because of a couple of big early saves that prevented us from going behind earlier. And Ian Maatsen was okay, but I think the Sill Hill star performer this time was the supporters who spent all that money and traveled all the way to Brugge. So here's what the staff at the Sill Hill Taproom in Aston are going to do. Listen carefully. Up until the Night with Champions, I put a link to those tickets in the description of this video. That's November 28th, by the way. Bring a printed copy of your ticket from the Brugge game. Send it up to the friendly proprietor behind the bar and say, I was one of the poor souls that traveled all the way to Brugge to watch that. And just see what happens. Perhaps the disappointment of what happened in Belgium, home of great beer, can be washed away with maybe a Brummy brew. But hey, don't worry about our recent form because we have Liverpool on Saturday. Yes, Liverpool, the team that leads not only the Premier League standings but also the Champions League, a team which, in my opinion, brushed aside a very fine Leverkusen side as if they were an annoying insect by making 2 changes from the game before. I believe it was just Nunez and Soboslai. And by the time Saturday rolls around, they'll have had an extra day to prepare for that game at home, where last year we were also brushed aside and we're probably lucky to come out of there losing just 3-0. So in other words, yeah, Now, this year's surprise package, Nottingham Forest, did manage to go to Anfield and surprisingly win 1-0 there earlier this season, but I'm afraid anything less than a result like that will only pile on the misery for Aston Villa heading into the international break in what has been a simply depressing end to October and start of November. Amadou Onana's going to start on Saturday. He didn't even play in Belgium, and Pau Torres will likely start as well, as he was spared for most of the proceedings on Wednesday. And I could see Jadon Philogene getting a wild card start like he did against Bayern Munich, because Leon Bailey is like kind of the rest of Villa right now. Where did he go? Where did they go? They're gone. How did this all go pear-shaped so quickly? You may never hear me say this again, but bring on the final international window of the year, which of course comes with its own perils, more air miles, potential injuries, mental fatigue. It was 16 days ago we beat Bologna. 16 days! A little over 2 weeks. What has happened since then? Well, we're winless. But our perception of this Aston Villa squad, both individually and collectively, has completely changed. And maybe most surprising of all, we are actually starting to question our manager. And I never thought that I would ever be watching an Unai Emery coached Aston Villa from between my fingers and behind the couch, but that's probably where you're going to find me on Saturday. Until then, take a deep breath and a long walk, make it a triple, and as always, up the mighty Villa!